Welcome, colleagues. Imagine this scenario. A 68-year-old man, recently admitted with a stroke and resulting dysphagia, develops a fever of 38.5 degrees Celsius, a productive cough, and mild hypoxemia on his third day in the hospital. He's been receiving tube feeding and is taking an antipsychotic medication for agitation. His chest X-ray reveals infiltrates in the superior segments of both lower lobes. Is this aspiration pneumonia? What organisms are likely responsible? Should you immediately add anaerobic coverage? How long should you treat him? And importantly, what can you do to prevent this from happening again? Today, we are going to explore the evidence-based answers to these exact questions. This lecture will equip you to confidently recognize, diagnose, and manage aspiration pneumonia in adults. By the end of our time together, you will be able to describe the epidemiology of aspiration pneumonia and differentiate it from aspiration pneumonitis and other related syndromes. You will learn to recognize the clinical constellation that should raise your suspicion for an aspiration etiology, and how the patient's position during the aspiration event directly dictates the distribution of infiltrates on imaging. We will apply the latest, evidence-based antibiotic selection principles anchored to current clinical evidence, based on the clinical setting and the risk for multi-drug-resistant organisms. Crucially, we will clarify the nuanced approach to anaerobic coverage. Finally, you will be able to justify when to add directed anaerobic therapy beyond standard regimens, and how to implement prevention strategies based on modifiable risk factors. Let's start with why this matters. Aspiration pneumonia accounts for 5 to 15% of all community-acquired pneumonia cases, and the prevalence is significantly higher in nursing home populations. What you must understand is the mortality risk. Aspiration pneumonia carries a substantially elevated mortality compared to other forms of community-acquired pneumonia. Some series report mortality rates up to 29%, compared to about 12% for other community-acquired pneumonias. Now, it's important to note that the 29% figure is partly confounded by hospital coding practices. Typical hospitalized mortality is closer to 10 to 15%, but the risk remains significantly elevated. This condition is often under-recognized. It exists on a continuum with community-acquired and hospital-acquired pneumonias. The key conceptual point to remember is this. Approximately 50% of healthy adults aspirate small amounts of oropharyngeal secretions during sleep without any consequence. It is the volume of the aspirate, the bacterial burden, and the failure of host defenses that determine whether clinical disease develops. One of the most critical distinctions in clinical practice is differentiating aspiration pneumonia from aspiration pneumonitis. They are fundamentally different entities requiring different management. Aspiration pneumonia is a bacterial infection resulting from the aspiration of colonized secretions. The onset is typically subacute, developing over hours to days. The aspiration event itself is usually unwitnessed. Because it is an infection, antibiotics are required. Aspiration pneumonitis, classically known as Mendelson syndrome, is a chemical injury caused by sterile gastric contents. The onset is acute, often within hours. The event is frequently witnessed, such as during the perioperative period. It typically involves a large volume of low-pH gastric fluid, generally less than 2.5. The management is supportive care. You reassess the patient at 24, 48, and 72 hours. Antibiotics are only indicated if a secondary infection develops. For completeness, remember there are other aspiration syndromes. Mechanical obstruction from food or a foreign body can cause airway blockage, the so-called café coronary syndrome. There is also lipoid pneumonia, a chronic inflammatory reaction to aspirated oils like mineral oil, diagnosed on computed tomography by fat attenuation. These are managed without antibiotics, but they complete the aspiration spectrum. Aspiration likelihood increases when multiple risk factors are present, and most of our patients have more than one. Neurologic and swallowing factors are paramount. Dysphagia is the single most important risk factor, carrying an odds ratio of approximately 12, which rises to nearly 13 when cerebrovascular disease is present. We see this in stroke, Parkinson's disease, dementia, multiple sclerosis, and head or neck cancer. Also, remember that 20% or more of recently extubated survivors experience dysphagia. Consciousness and airway defense are critical. Impaired consciousness from stroke, overdose, sedation, anesthesia, or alcohol removes protective reflexes. Antipsychotic medications increase risk by 1.5 times. Narcotics impair the cough reflex. Mechanical disruptions like a tracheostomy or intubation also bypass normal defenses. Feeding methods and oral health play a major role. Enteral feeding, especially with gastric dysmotility, increases risk. Poor oral hygiene leads to increased gram-negative colonization, while poor dentition increases anaerobic colonization. Finally, advancing age, frailty, being bedridden, underweight status, nursing home residence, and a history of cardiac arrest all significantly compound the risk. Let's address a very current topic: GLP-1 receptor agonists and perioperative aspiration risk. Medications like semaglutide and tirzepatide delay gastric emptying, increasing residual gastric contents by approximately 5 to 6-fold. This raises a theoretical risk of aspiration under anesthesia or sedation. However, actual measured aspiration rates remain very low, at around 0.1 to 0.2%, and meta-analyses show no significant increase compared to controls. The current guidance from a multi-society consensus in October 2024 is to continue these medications and not routinely hold them. Risk stratification is key. For higher-risk scenarios, such as patients in the dose escalation phase, those on high doses, those with gastrointestinal symptoms, or concurrent conditions like Parkinson's disease, recommendations include a 24-hour clear liquid diet before the procedure, treating them as a full stomach and considering gastric point-of-care ultrasound. For lower-risk patients on a stable dose without symptoms, standard fasting may suffice, though some 2025 society statements lean toward a 24-hour clear liquid diet for all patients on GLP-1 agonists. The fasting specifics remain debated into 2026. Crucially, remember this is a perioperative concern. Aspiration of gastric contents at induction behaves like chemical pneumonitis, not the bacterial aspiration pneumonia we are focusing on today. And importantly, withholding these medications only in obese or overweight patients may constitute bias and should be avoided. How do we recognize aspiration pneumonia? It's not about mandatory criteria. It's about a clinical constellation. The precondition is that the patient actually has pneumonia, meaning clinical and radiographic findings are present. Once pneumonia is established, you should suspect an aspiration etiology when one or more of the following are present. First, risk factors for aspiration, which we just discussed. The presence of multiple risk factors significantly increases the likelihood. Second, a gravity-dependent infiltrate distribution. If the patient aspirated while supine, look for infiltrates in the superior segments of the lower lobes or the posterior segments of the upper lobes. If they were upright, look at the basal segments of the lower lobes. A bronchopneumonia pattern is much more common than a lobar pattern, occurring in 68% of cases, and approximately 92% of patients have posterior infiltrates. Third, a compatible clinical context. This could be a witnessed aspiration event, recent extubation, residence in a nursing home, a recent stroke, or the presence of putrid sputum, which strongly suggests an anaerobic infection. Remember, a witnessed event is not required, as most aspirations are unwitnessed. Furthermore, a negative initial chest X-ray does not exclude the diagnosis. Imaging is negative initially in about 28% of confirmed cases. The diagnosis of aspiration pneumonia is fundamentally clinical. There is no specific biomarker. Procalcitonin does not reliably distinguish aspiration pneumonia from pneumonitis or other types of pneumonia. You must integrate the clinical presentation, the risk factors, and the radiographic findings. For imaging, the chest X-ray will often show dependent infiltrates in a bronchopneumonia pattern. Cavitation suggests an anaerobic or necrotizing infection, while bilateral symmetric infiltrates should make you consider an alternative diagnosis like negative pressure pulmonary edema. Computed tomography of the chest is more sensitive and should be used when your clinical suspicion is high but the chest X-ray is negative. Additionally, the 2025 American Thoracic Society guideline conditionally suggests lung ultrasound as an acceptable alternative where point-of-care ultrasound expertise exists, noting a sensitivity of approximately 95% compared to 70% for chest X-ray. You should have a high index of suspicion in specific scenarios. Pneumonia in a patient with dysphagia after a witnessed choking or vomiting event, in a patient with impaired consciousness, in a bedridden nursing home resident, in a recently extubated patient, or when a patient presents subacutely with putrid sputum, necrotizing pneumonia, or a lung abscess combined with poor dentition. We must understand the paradigm shift in the microbiology of aspiration pneumonia. Historically, from the 1970s through the 1990s, anaerobes like Peptostreptococcus and bacteroids were considered the predominant pathogens. This led to the practice of providing routine anaerobic coverage for every case. However, current evidence shows a significant shift toward aerobic organisms, typical of community-acquired and hospital-acquired pneumonias. The large international GLIMP study found that anaerobic flora were similar between patients with and without aspiration risk factors, present in only 0 to 1.6% of cases. In the community setting, expect Streptococcus pneumoniae, Staphylococcus aureus, Haemophilus influenza, and Enterobacteriaceae. In the hospital setting, expect gram-negative bacilli including Pseudomonas aeruginosa and multi-drug-resistant organisms. Anaerobes still matter, but primarily in specific situations. Lung abscess, necrotizing pneumonia, empyema, severe periodontal disease, and when the patient has putrid sputum or a subacute presentation. The evidence-based approach is nuanced. Do not add a separate anaerobic agent routinely. Instead, preferentially select regimens that already contain built-in anaerobic coverage, such as ampicillin sulbactam or amoxicillin clavulinate. Only add directed anaerobic coverage for high-risk presentations like witnessed large-volume aspiration, cavitation, lung abscess, putrid sputum, or severe periodontal disease. Let's look at the specific, evidence-based regimens for community-acquired aspiration pneumonia. For outpatients with non-severe disease, the preferred regimen is oral amoxicillin clavulinate. This is preferred in current guidelines because it provides built-in anaerobic coverage. For patients with a penicillin allergy, moxifloxacin or clindamycin are options, though moxifloxacin is less preferred due to rising anaerobe resistance. Also, remember the FDA warnings regarding fluoroquinolones. They carry risks for hypoglycemia, central nervous system effects, and aortic aneurysm or dissection. Reserve them. For hospital-acquired aspiration pneumonia, we must consider the risk of multidrug-resistant organisms. For patients who are not severely ill and have a low risk for multidrug-resistant organisms, the approach is similar to the community-acquired regimens we just discussed. However, for patients who are severely ill or at high risk for multidrug-resistant organisms, broader coverage is required. Preferred regimens include intravenous piperacillin tazobactam, imipenem, or meropenem. If the patient has risk factors for MRSA, you must add vancomycin or linezolid. The duration of therapy is typically 7 days for hospital-acquired cases, again, extending longer only for complications like abscess or empyema. When do you add directed anaerobic coverage beyond these selections? Only for high-risk presentations, witnessed large-volume aspiration, cavitation, lung abscess, putrid sputum, or severe periodontal disease. In these cases, add intravenous clindamycin or metronidazole. A critical caveat: metronidazole must never be used as monotherapy for aspiration pneumonia, as it has an approximately 50% failure rate when used alone. And remember the current clinical warning that anaerobe resistance to moxifloxacin is rising, so it is not adequately studied to recommend as first-line therapy. Here is a unified decision framework to guide your treatment. Step 1. Establish the diagnosis based on pneumonia, risk factors, and gravity-dependent infiltrates. Step 2. Determine the site of acquisition. Is it community-acquired, meaning onset prior to or within 48 hours of hospitalization, or hospital-acquired? Step 3. Assess the severity of illness and the risk for multi-drug-resistant organisms based on prior antibiotics, prolonged hospitalization, or intensive care unit admission. Step 4. Select your regimen. For non-severe community or hospital-acquired cases, use amoxicillin clavulinate or ampicillin sulbactam. For severe hospital-acquired cases or high multi-drug-resistant risk, use piperacillin tazobactam, imipenem, or meropenem, adding vancomycin or linezolid if MRSA is a concern. Step 5. Ask yourself, are there high-risk features requiring directed anaerobic coverage? If there is large-volume witnessed aspiration, cavitation, lung abscess, putrid sputum, or severe periodontal disease, add clindamycin or metronidazole, but not metronidazole alone. Step 6. Evaluate the clinical response at 48 to 72 hours. If improving, continue. If not, reassess the diagnosis and consider complications. Step 7. Determine duration. 5 days for community-acquired, 7 days for hospital-acquired, and longer for complications. Prevention is multifaceted. While some interventions have strong evidence, others are more nuanced. Swallowing evaluation and therapy by a speech-language pathologist, especially post-stroke, is strongly supported. Promoting oral feeding with modified diets over tube feeding is preferred when safe. Positioning and feeding techniques are standard practice, though the evidence is mixed. Semi-recumbent positioning at 30 to 45 degrees is favored. A chin-down posture is often preferred for patient tolerability, Though large trials show it may not be the absolute best aspiration reducer compared to thickened liquids, the evidence for oral hygiene is actually inconsistent. While a meta-analysis of toothbrushing showed a relative risk reduction, 2 large cluster randomized trials in nursing homes showed no reduction in pneumonia. Chlorhexidine rinses also have mixed evidence. Medication optimization has a clear benefit. Minimize antipsychotics, sedatives, narcotics, and antihistamines, and discontinue unnecessary acid-suppressive therapy. Angiotensin-converting enzyme inhibitors may reduce aspiration risk in post-stroke patients by elevating substance P, with the strongest benefits seen in Asian populations. However, they should be used when indicated for other reasons, not started solely for aspiration prevention. A comprehensive bundle approach works. The Swiss non-ventilator hospital-acquired pneumonia trial demonstrated a 31% reduction in hospital-wide pneumonias using a bundle approach. Let's briefly review the management of chemical pneumonitis, or Mendelson syndrome. The cornerstone is supportive care, airway maintenance, oxygen, and mechanical ventilation if needed. Bronchoscopy may remove particulate matter but does not reverse the chemical injury. For antibiotic management in mild to moderate cases, withhold antibiotics initially and reassess the patient at 24, 48, and 72 hours. For severe cases, empiric antibiotics may be started, but discontinue them if the patient improves with supportive care alone. What about corticosteroids? The decision depends on the scenario. For non-severe aspiration pneumonia or chemical pneumonitis, steroids are not recommended. However, there was a major shift in 2025. Based on the 2023 Cape Cod trial, the American Thoracic Society now conditionally suggests hydrocortisone for community-acquired pneumonia meeting severe criteria. This positive evidence is specific to hydrocortisone continuous infusion. Trials using methylprednisolone were negative. If the patient develops aspiration-related acute respiratory distress syndrome, consider steroids per ARDS protocols, but do not stack regimens if they also meet severe pneumonia criteria. Let's summarize the essential takeaways. 1. Aspiration pneumonia is common and carries a substantially elevated mortality compared to other community-acquired pneumonias. 2. Dysphagia is the single most important risk factor and the most important target for prevention. 3. Distinguish bacterial pneumonia from chemical pneumonitis. Pneumonitis requires supportive care and reassessment at 24, 48, and 72 hours before committing to antibiotics. 4. Follow the evidence-based approach for anaerobes. Select regimens with built-in coverage, and only add directed coverage for specific high-risk features. 5. Diagnosis is clinical, integrating risk factors and gravity-dependent infiltrates. 6. Use evidence-based regimens. Treat community-acquired for 5 days and hospital-acquired for 7 days. Never use metronidazole as monotherapy. 7. Prevention evidence is mixed, but a comprehensive bundle including swallowing evaluation and medication optimization is beneficial. 8. For GLP-1 receptor agonists, continue the medication but risk stratify for the perioperative period. Recognizing this is a chemical pneumonitis risk. 9. Be aware that the 2025 American Thoracic Society guideline is ATS only, and most recommendations are conditional. 10. Always individualize every decision for the patient in front of you. Let's return to our opening case. Our 68-year-old post-stroke patient developed pneumonia on hospital day 3. This makes it hospital-acquired. He had no risk factors for multidrug-resistant organisms, no prior antibiotics, not in the intensive care unit, and a short stay. Therefore, intravenous ampicillin sulbactam is appropriate, as it provides built-in anaerobic coverage. You assess him and find no putrid sputum, no cavitation, and no severe periodontal disease. So you correctly decide not to add a directed anaerobic agent like clindamycin. You plan to treat him for 7 days for uncomplicated hospital-acquired pneumonia. Simultaneously, you initiate a prevention bundle, a formal swallowing evaluation, semi-recumbent positioning, oral hygiene, and a critical review of his medications, specifically his antipsychotic. I encourage you to review the comprehensive references provided in the video description below, and always perform your own clinical analysis for each patient. Consult infectious disease specialists when you are uncertain, and ensure your decisions are individualized and free from bias. Thank you for your attention. Think critically, individualize your approach, and treat effectively.